The story begins not with explosions or grand declarations of war, but with something far more mundane, a simple mathematical equation scratched onto paper in a Tokyo naval office. It was early 1941, and the world stood on the precipice of a conflict that would reshape entire continents. In the dimly lit rooms of Japan's Naval General Staff headquarters, officers pored over calculations that would determine their nation's fate. They were planning something audacious, something that would require precision down to the last detail. Admiral Yamamoto sat at his desk, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling as he reviewed the fuel consumption reports for the combined fleet. A graduate of Harvard University and former naval attaché to Washington, Yamamoto understood better than most the industrial might of America. He'd walked the streets of Detroit, seen the factories churning out automobiles by the thousands. He knew what that manufacturing capacity could become if turned toward instruments of war. This knowledge kept him awake at night, gnawing at his confidence like waves against a ship's hull. The plan taking shape was nothing less than a knockout blow, a surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. But such an operation required moving the entire Kido Butai, Japan's carrier strike force, across thousands of miles of open ocean without detection. The calculations were staggering. 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 3 submarines would make the journey. Each vessel would need precise amounts of fuel, not just for the journey to Hawaii, but for the return trip, for evasive maneuvers, for combat operations. Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Ami was tasked with calculating the fuel requirements. He was meticulous by nature, a man who double-checked his arithmetic and questioned his assumptions. But even the most careful minds can stumble when confronted with complexity. The fuel calculations required converting between different measurement systems, kiloliters, tons, barrels, and accounting for variables like weather conditions, ship speeds, and combat contingencies. It was here, in these conversions and contingencies, that the seeds of error were planted. What made this particular miscalculation so consequential was its timing. Japan's strategic position was deteriorating by the month. American oil embargoes were strangling the Japanese war machine. The Dutch East Indies beckoned with their rich petroleum reserves, but seizing them would mean war with Britain and America. Time was running short, and with it, Japan's options narrowed to a dangerous few. The mathematics of fuel consumption weren't just numbers on paper, they were the arithmetic of survival. The mathematics of survival. This phrase echoed through the halls of the Naval General Staff as spring turned to summer in 1941. Lieutenant Commander Ami worked methodically through his calculations, his pencil moving across page after page of figures. The task before him was to determine not just the fuel needed for the Pearl Harbor strike, but the fuel requirements for the entire opening phase of what would become the Pacific War. Japan planned simultaneous operations across an area spanning from Hawaii to Malaya, from the Philippines to Wake Island. The complexity was overwhelming. Different ships consumed fuel at different rates. The carriers were particularly thirsty, their massive engines requiring enormous quantities of heavy fuel oil. The Akagi and Kaga, converted from battleship hulls, were especially inefficient. Then there were the weather considerations. Headwinds increased fuel consumption, as did heavy seas that forced ships to reduce speed or alter course. The northern Pacific in winter was notoriously unpredictable, with storms that could scatter a fleet or delay operations by days. Ami consulted with the fleet's engineering officers, gathering data on fuel consumption rates at various speeds. The carriers consumed approximately 0.7 tons per hour at cruising speed, but this could spike dramatically during flight operations when they needed to turn into the wind and increase speed to launch aircraft. The destroyers were more efficient but had smaller fuel capacities, meaning they would need to refuel from tankers multiple times during the journey. These tankers themselves became variables in the equation. Each one carried finite fuel and could only refuel so many ships before needing to break away and return to base. But there was another layer to these calculations that made them treacherous. The fuel wasn't just for getting to Pearl Harbor and back. The task force would need fuel for searching, for potential encounters with American patrols, for prolonged combat if the element of surprise was lost. They would need fuel to maintain radio silence while maneuvering into position. They would need fuel reserves for emergencies, mechanical breakdowns, storm damage, or unexpected changes to the operation. Each contingency added percentage points to the total, and each percentage point represented thousands of tons of precious fuel oil. The pressure on Ami was immense. Give too low an estimate, and the fleet might run dry mid-ocean, leaving Japan's most valuable warships dead in the water. Give too high an estimate, and the operation might be deemed impossible, forcing Japan to seek other, perhaps less favorable, options. The entire strategic calculus of the coming war hinged on whether these ships could make the journey. Every staff officer knew it. Every calculation carried the weight of national destiny. As summer progressed into fall, the calculations were finalized. The numbers looked tight but achievable. The task force would sail north through the frigid waters between Japan and the Aleutian Islands, refuel from tankers at a designated point, then race south toward Hawaii. After the attack, they would refuel again before returning to Japanese waters. It would be close, dangerously close, but the mathematics said it could be done. It could be done. Those 4 words, spoken with confidence in briefing rooms, masked the razor-thin margins that separated success from catastrophe. The route chosen for the Pearl Harbor strike force was as audacious as the attack itself. Rather than taking the more direct path across the Central Pacific, where American patrol aircraft and ships might spot them, the Japanese fleet would steam north into the empty reaches where the North Pacific meets the Bering Sea. This northern route was inspired partly by necessity and partly by precedent. In 1924, American aviators had demonstrated that aircraft could fly from Alaska to Japan by island hopping through the Aleutians. If planes could make that journey, surely ships could as well. The area was known to be largely deserted, too far north for commercial shipping lanes, too remote for regular patrols. American forces in the Aleutians were minimal, consisting mainly of a small Coast Guard presence, and weather stations manned by handfuls of personnel who spent their days watching endless gray seas. The plan called for the task force to assemble in Haidokapa Bay in the Kuril Islands, a remote anchorage that offered both shelter and secrecy. From there, they would proceed eastward, maintaining strict radio silence while staying far enough north to avoid detection. The fuel calculations showed they would need to refuel approximately 900 miles north of Midway Island, at a point chosen for its remoteness and relatively calm seas. 8 tankers would make the journey with the strike force, carrying the precious fuel oil that would keep the fleet moving. But the northern route came with its own challenges that complicated the fuel equations. The seas in that region during November were notorious for their ferocity. Waves could reach heights of 30 feet or more, forcing ships to reduce speed or alter course. These maneuvers burned extra fuel that wasn't always accounted for in calculations based on ideal conditions. The cold itself was a factor. Engines performed differently in near-freezing temperatures, and crews needed heating systems running constantly to prevent equipment from freezing. Navigation through these waters required exceptional skill. Stars were often obscured by clouds, and the magnetic compasses behaved erratically so close to the North Pole. Dead reckoning became essential, with navigators calculating position based on speed and direction alone. But if these calculations were even slightly off, the entire fleet could miss its refueling rendezvous, and without that fuel, the operation would fail before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. The margin for error was measured in miles and hours, not in comfortable margins of safety. Admiral Nagumo, chosen to command the strike force, was acutely aware of these risks. He was a torpedo specialist by training, more comfortable with surface warfare than carrier aviation. The responsibility weighed heavily on him. During planning meetings, he repeatedly questioned whether the fuel calculations were sound. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Ryanosuke Kusaka, assured him that everything had been triple-checked. The numbers worked. The operation was feasible. They would have enough fuel. They would have enough fuel, or so everyone believed as the fleet gathered in Hitokapa Bay that gray November morning. The 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, rode at anchor surrounded by their escorts. Crews made final preparations, loading ammunition, conducting last maintenance checks, ensuring every system was ready for the historic journey ahead. Down in the ship's bunkers, fuel oil was pumped aboard until the tanks registered full. Everything appeared to be proceeding according to plan. But something was wrong with the calculations, though no one realized it yet. The error had originated months earlier during the initial planning phases, embedded so deeply in the assumptions that it went unquestioned through every subsequent review. Lieutenant Commander Ami had based his fuel consumption estimates on data provided by the Navy's Engineering Division. These estimates assumed certain operational conditions, specific speeds, specific sea states, specific weather patterns. They were reasonable assumptions, averages drawn from peacetime operations and training exercises. What Ami couldn't have known was that the data itself contained a subtle but significant error. The Engineering Division had provided fuel consumption rates based on tests conducted in relatively calm seas during summer months. These rates were then extrapolated to predict consumption under winter conditions in the North Pacific. The extrapolation used a multiplier that was supposed to account for the increased resistance of heavy seas and the decreased efficiency of engines in cold weather. Someone, no one ever determined exactly who, had applied the wrong multiplier. The error was less than 10%, small enough to escape notice during casual review but large enough to matter desperately in practice. 10% of the total fuel requirement represented hundreds of tons of fuel oil, fuel that wouldn't be there when it was needed. Worse, the error compounded through the various stages of the operation. If the carriers consumed 10% more fuel getting to the refueling point, they'd have less margin for the approach to Hawaii. If they consumed 10% more during flight operations, they'd have less for the return journey. Each phase of the operation became slightly more precarious than the planners had anticipated. The fleet sailed on November 26, 1941, slipping out of Hitokapa Bay into the gray Pacific dawn. As they headed east, the first hints of the problem began to emerge. Fuel consumption rates were higher than predicted. Ship captains reported their tanks draining faster than the charts indicated they should. Engineers checked and rechecked their systems, finding nothing wrong with the engines themselves. The ships were performing exactly as designed. The problem lay not in the vessels but in the calculations that had predicted their performance. Admiral Nagumo received these reports with growing concern. He huddled with his staff, reviewing the numbers, trying to determine what it meant for the operation. The conclusion was disturbing but not yet catastrophic. They would likely have enough fuel to reach Pearl Harbor and conduct the attack. But the return journey had suddenly become questionable. The comfortable margins had evaporated. They were committed now, too far from Japan to turn back without looking foolish, but not yet far enough to guarantee success. The mathematics of war had caught them in an uncertain space between retreat and victory. Between retreat and victory, the Japanese strike force found itself suspended in a limbo of uncertainty. The northern Pacific around them was empty, devoid of other ships, devoid even of birds this far from land. Just endless gray water and gray sky, merging at a horizon that seemed impossibly distant. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of the Akagi, his flagship, watching the waves and contemplating the dilemma before him. The refueling point was still days away, and already the fuel situation was becoming precarious. The carriers themselves would likely make it to Hawaii. Their large bunkers gave them more margin for error than the smaller escorts. But the destroyers were a different story. These nimble ships, essential for anti-submarine screening and scouting, carried less fuel relative to their consumption rates. Several destroyer captains had already reported they were burning fuel faster than anticipated. If the trend continued, some destroyers might not have enough to return to Japan, even if everything else went perfectly. Nagumo called a conference with his senior officers. They gathered in Akagi's operations room, charts spread across tables, slide rules and mechanical calculators at hand. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical planner who had refined the Pearl Harbor attack plan, argued for continuing the operation. The fuel situation was concerning but not critical. They could economize, reduce speed slightly, minimize unnecessary maneuvering, perhaps leave 1 or 2 destroyers at the refueling point rather than taking them all the way to Hawaii. These adjustments would stretch their fuel reserves and keep the operation viable. But Rear Admiral Kosaka, the Chief of Staff, saw the situation differently. The error in fuel calculations suggested other aspects of the plan might also contain hidden flaws. If they had miscalculated fuel consumption, what else might they have miscalculated? Enemy patrol patterns? Response times? The number of ships in Pearl Harbor? Each assumption now seemed suspect, each calculation potentially compromised. He advocated for canceling the operation and returning to Japan. Better to preserve the fleet intact than risk stranding it thousands of miles from home. The debate went back and forth for hours. Maps were studied, weather reports analyzed, fuel consumption data recalculated. The mathematics that had once seemed so certain now appeared malleable, capable of supporting either conclusion depending on which assumptions you chose to emphasize. Nagumo listened to all arguments, his weathered face revealing nothing of the turmoil he felt inside. This decision would define his career, perhaps define Japan's war effort. He could turn back and be branded a coward, or press forward and potentially lead his fleet to destruction in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Finally, Nagumo made his choice. They would continue, but with modifications. Speed would be reduced by 2 knots, saving fuel at the cost of time. 2 of the destroyers would remain with the tankers after refueling rather than making the full journey to Hawaii. Flight operations would be streamlined to minimize time spent at high speed. These compromises would degrade the operation's effectiveness somewhat, but they would improve the odds of getting everyone home safely. It was the decision of a cautious man, one who valued preservation of force over maximum destruction of the enemy. Section 6. Ripples through time. Preservation of force over maximum destruction. This principle, born from miscalculated fuel consumption, would echo through the Pacific War in ways no one could have anticipated that cold December morning. The Japanese strike force continued its journey toward Hawaii, the crews unaware that the modifications to their plan were already reshaping the battle to come. The 2 destroyers left behind with the tankers were named Kasumi and Arare. Their absence would matter more than anyone realized. These destroyers had been assigned specific roles in the Pearl Harbor attack. Kasumi was supposed to patrol the western approaches to Pearl Harbor, watching for American submarines that might be entering or leaving the base. Arare was tasked with screening the carriers from torpedo attack during the actual strike, positioning itself between the flat tops and any potential threats. Without them, these roles had to be redistributed among the remaining escorts, spreading those ships thinner, reducing the density of the protective screen around the carriers. Admiral Nagumo's decision to reduce speed by 2 knots had consequences as well. It meant the fleet would arrive at the launch point for the Pearl Harbor strike approximately 3 hours later than originally planned. 3 hours might seem like nothing in the grand scheme of a war, but timing was everything in this operation. The original plan called for the first wave of aircraft to arrive over Pearl Harbor at precisely 7:55 a.m. local time, when many American sailors would still be at breakfast, when the ships would be fully manned with crew and less ready to respond to sudden attack. The 3-hour delay meant adjusting the launch time, which meant adjusting the approach course, which meant consuming slightly more fuel to maintain the schedule as closely as possible. Like stones thrown into a pond, the ripples spread outward, each adjustment necessitating another adjustment, each compromise forcing another compromise. The attack plan that had been so carefully crafted, so precisely timed, was being reshaped in real time by the mathematics of fuel consumption. The operation was becoming something different from what had been envisioned in those Tokyo planning rooms months earlier. But perhaps the most significant consequence of the fuel miscalculation wouldn't be felt until after the attack itself. The need to conserve fuel meant that Nagumo had virtually no margin for additional operations. The original Pearl Harbor plan had included provisions for a potential third wave of attacks if the first two waves achieved overwhelming success. This third wave would have targeted Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities and ship repair facilities, infrastructure that would prove crucial to American recovery efforts in the months ahead. With the fuel situation so tight, the third wave became impossible. Every drop of fuel had to be saved for the journey home. Some historians argue this was the most consequential impact of the mathematical error. The Americans lost battleships at Pearl Harbor, but the base remained operational. The fuel oil stored there, millions of gallons of it, survived intact. The repair facilities survived intact. In the months that followed, these resources enabled the American Pacific Fleet to recover far more quickly than the Japanese had anticipated. Ships that might have taken years to repair in California could be fixed in months at Pearl Harbor itself. The fuel that might have burned in Japanese bombs instead powered American operations throughout 1942. The fuel that powered American operations was, that December morning, still safely stored in massive tanks clustered around Pearl Harbor's waterfront. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda led the first wave of Japanese aircraft toward Oahu, his bomber flying through scattered clouds as the sun rose behind them. Below, the island of Oahu emerged from the dawn mist, green mountains shadowed in the early light, white surf visible along the beaches. It looked peaceful, almost serene. Fukuda's radio crackled with confirmations from other flight leaders. 183 aircraft filled the sky, bombers, torpedo planes, fighters, all converging on the largest concentration of American naval power in the Pacific. As they approached the harbor entrance, Fukuda could see the ships arranged like toys in a bathtub. Battleship Row stood out clearly, 7 massive vessels moored in pairs, their gray hulls catching the morning light. The sight filled him with both excitement and dread. This was history being made, for better or worse. At 7:48 a.m., 7 minutes earlier than originally planned due to the overnight recalculations, Fukuda transmitted the signal that would live in infamy. Tora, Tora, Tora! The code indicating complete surprise had been achieved. Below him, the American base was just beginning to stir. Some sailors were already awake, preparing for morning colors, but most remained at breakfast or asleep in their bunks. The Sunday morning routine proceeded normally, peacefully, ignorant of the violence about to descend. The torpedo bombers struck first, their weapons specially modified with wooden fins to work in Pearl Harbor's shallow waters. The torpedoes splashed into the harbor one after another, their tracks visible in the clear morning water as they homed in on Battleship Row. Explosions rippled along the moored ships, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, Arizona. Each hit sent shudders through the harbor, through the base, through the American sense of invulnerability that had existed since the nation's founding. Water geysered skyward, mixed with oil and debris and occasionally, sickeningly, with human remains. The high-level bombers followed, their payloads aimed at ships the torpedo planes had missed or hadn't finished. Commander Fukuda watched the battle unfold beneath him, marking targets hit, noting ships burning or listing, trying to assess how much damage was being inflicted. The scene was chaotic, smoke from burning ships mixed with anti-aircraft fire, making visibility difficult. The Americans were fighting back now, their initial shock giving way to determined resistance. Tracers arced up from ships and shore batteries, creating deadly corridors through which the Japanese planes had to fly. But even as the attack achieved tactical success, the limitations imposed by the fuel miscalculation were making themselves felt. The aircraft carriers, positioned northwest of Oahu, were burning fuel at a higher rate than planned as they steamed into the wind to launch and recover aircraft. Admiral Nagumo received constant updates on fuel status from his engineering officers. The numbers were worse than the morning's estimates had projected. The carriers needed to finish operations and begin the journey home soon, sooner than the original schedule allowed. This urgency would shape every decision made in the hours ahead, would determine which targets received attention and which were left untouched. Left untouched, the fuel tanks loomed over Pearl Harbor like giant white cylinders, each containing hundreds of thousands of gallons of precious oil. Commander Fukuda orbited above the harbor as the second wave of Japanese aircraft pressed home their attacks. Below, Battleship Row was a scene of devastation. Arizona had exploded, her forward magazine detonating with such force that the blast wave had been felt miles away. Oklahoma had capsized, her hull showing above the water like the back of a surfacing whale. West Virginia and California were sinking at their moorings. Nevada, attempting to escape the harbor, had been beached to prevent her from blocking the channel. The damage was immense, far beyond what the planners had dared hope. But as Fukuda assessed the situation, he realized something crucial: the American aircraft carriers were not in port. Lexington, Enterprise, and Saratoga, the primary targets of the entire operation, were absent. Enterprise and Lexington were at sea, delivering aircraft to Midway and Wake Islands. Saratoga was on the west coast, undergoing maintenance. The most valuable prizes had escaped. This changed everything about the day's calculations. Aboard Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced another critical decision. His air commanders were radioing recommendations for a third-wave attack. The targets were clear: those fuel storage facilities, the ship repair facilities, the submarine base. Commander Genda was particularly insistent. The carriers had been spared by chance, but Japan could still cripple Pearl Harbor's ability to function as a forward base. Without fuel and repair facilities, the Americans would be forced to withdraw to the west coast, adding thousands of miles to any operations in the western Pacific. The strategic impact could be as significant as sinking the carriers themselves. But the fuel situation made this decision agonizing. The carriers had been burning oil at the higher than predicted rates throughout the operation. Weather conditions were deteriorating. A storm system was moving in from the northwest, the same direction from which the fleet would need to retreat. If they delayed departure for a third wave, they would be steaming directly into that storm system, fighting heavy seas that would increase fuel consumption even further. The destroyers were already reporting critically low fuel levels. Some might not make it back even if they left immediately. There was another consideration as well. The Americans now knew where the Japanese carriers were, roughly northwest of Oahu. Their own carriers, wherever they currently were, would be racing to intercept. Nagumo's fleet was most vulnerable while conducting flight operations, when ships had to maintain steady courses into the wind, unable to maneuver freely. If American carriers arrived while the Japanese were launching or recovering a third wave, the tactical advantage could reverse catastrophically. The hunters could become the hunted. Nagumo weighed these factors with his characteristic caution. The fuel miscalculation that had seemed like a minor planning error months ago now forced him to choose between aggressive pursuit of maximum damage and prudent preservation of his fleet. The decision came down to mathematics once again, not the mathematics of pre-war planning rooms, but the cold arithmetic of fuel gauges and weather reports and risk assessment. At 1:30 p.m., Nagumo gave the order. They would not launch a third wave. The task force would break off and begin the journey home. The fuel tanks at Pearl Harbor would survive intact, waiting to power American revenge. The American revenge would have to wait for another day. As Nagumo's carriers turned northwest, heading into the darkening seas, the storm system forecasters had warned about began to overtake them. Within hours, the ships were laboring through heavy seas, green water breaking over their bows, spray coating everything with salt. The destroyer captains reported their fuel situations were becoming critical. Some ships were down to less than 20% of capacity, far less than desired for the 1,000-mile journey still ahead. The fleet had to reduce speed even further to help the destroyers conserve fuel. This meant wallowing in the heavy seas rather than punching through them, a miserable motion that left crews exhausted and equipment strained. Down in the engineering spaces, men worked constantly to keep the fuel pumps operating, to monitor the bunkers, to transfer oil from one tank to another to maintain proper trim. Every gallon counted. Every calculation mattered. On December 9th, the fleet again met its tankers at the predetermined refueling point. This should have been a routine operation, practiced many times in peacetime exercises. But the heavy seas made it extraordinarily difficult. Ships had to maintain precise positions relative to the tankers while fuel lines were passed across. The slightest error could part the lines or collide the vessels. Several times the process had to be halted as seas became too rough to risk continuing. Precious hours were lost, hours during which the ships burned fuel, while making no progress toward home. The most critical moment came with the destroyers. These small ships had exhausted their fuel reserves and were running on vapors. One destroyer, Ayrshire, reported her fuel bunkers were essentially empty. She would need to be taken under tow if refueling couldn't be accomplished soon. The prospect of towing a destroyer through heavy seas while potentially under threat from American submarines or aircraft was nightmare-inducing. It would slow the entire fleet, increase everyone's vulnerability, and consume even more of the precious fuel they were trying to conserve. Working through the night, in darkness broken only by hooded lamps, the fueling crews managed to transfer enough oil to get Ayrshire and the other critical destroyers mobile again. But it was a near thing, closer than anyone wanted to admit publicly. If the seas had been just slightly heavier, if the rendezvous had been delayed by just a few more hours, if any of a dozen small things had gone differently, the triumphant strike force might have found itself crippled not by enemy action but by simple lack of fuel. The irony would have been bitter. Japan's mightiest warships, paralyzed in mid-ocean by an arithmetic error made in a distant office months before. The task force finally reached Japanese waters on December 23, 3 days later than originally scheduled, and with fuel bunkers scraped nearly clean. Some destroyers entered port with their gauges reading 0, running on whatever fuel remained trapped in their systems. The crew were exhausted, physically and emotionally drained by the tension of the extended journey. But they had succeeded. Pearl Harbor had been struck. America was at war. Japan had achieved its opening gambit. Only later would historians piece together how close the entire operation had come to disaster, and how a simple mathematical error had reshaped the battle in subtle but profound ways. The mathematics of war continued to shape the Pacific conflict in the months and years that followed Pearl Harbor. The fuel storage tanks that survived at Pearl Harbor proved crucial to American operations throughout 1942. When Admiral Nimitz took command of the Pacific Fleet on December 31, 1941, one of his first actions was to inspect those tanks, to verify they remained intact and operational. The fuel they contained, over 4 million barrels of it, meant Pearl Harbor could continue functioning as the primary American forward base in the Pacific. This had immediate consequences. American carriers damaged in early 1942 battles could be repaired at Pearl Harbor rather than having to limp all the way back to the West Coast. American submarines could refuel and rearm quickly between patrols rather than spending weeks in transit. When intelligence breakthroughs allowed Nimitz to position his carriers for the Battle of Midway in June 1942, the fuel from those Pearl Harbor tanks ensured his ships could reach their positions and remain on station long enough to ambush the Japanese fleet. Meanwhile, Japan's fuel situation continued to deteriorate. The miscalculation that had plagued the Pearl Harbor operation proved to be symptomatic of larger problems in Japanese planning and logistics. Japan had gone to war partly to secure oil resources in the Dutch East Indies, but getting that oil to Japan proved far more difficult than anticipated. Tankers were vulnerable to submarine attack. The refineries in Borneo and Sumatra required months to repair and bring back to full production. The intricate mathematics of fuel consumption, refining capacity, tanker availability, and strategic needs grew increasingly complex and increasingly unfavorable. By 1944, the fuel shortage had become critical. Japanese carriers sat in port, unable to conduct adequate training because fuel was too precious to burn in exercises. Pilots went into combat with minimal flying hours, facing American aviators who had received extensive training. The quality gap this created was as devastating as any technical advantage. When the Battle of the Philippine Sea occurred in June 1944, Japanese aircraft were shot down in such numbers that American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The well-trained American pilots massacred their poorly trained Japanese opponents, partly because Japan couldn't afford the fuel to train them properly. The mathematical error that had seemed so trivial in 1941, a miscalculated multiplier, a wrong extrapolation, perhaps 10% deviation from reality, had grown into a strategic nightmare by 1944. It hadn't been the only factor, certainly. American industrial production, cryptographic breakthroughs, tactical innovations, and countless individual acts of courage all played their parts in determining the war's outcome. But the fuel issue, first revealed during the approach to Pearl Harbor, remained a constant thread through the entire conflict, shaping decisions at every level from tactical to strategic. In retrospect, historians debate whether the fuel miscalculation ultimately helped or hurt Japan's war effort. On one hand, it prevented the third wave at Pearl Harbor, leaving American infrastructure intact to support recovery and eventual counteroffensive. On the other hand, it imposed a caution on Japanese commanders that perhaps saved their fleet from even greater disasters. If the carriers had been lost attempting overly ambitious operations, Japan's situation would have been even more desperate. What remains undeniable is that this single mathematical error, this miscalculated fuel consumption multiplier, rippled through the entire Pacific War. It affected battle plans, strategic decisions, tactical choices. It serves as a reminder that war, despite all its chaos and violence, ultimately comes down to mathematics and logistics. The side that can move more men and more material to the right place at the right time, and keep them supplied once they're there, has an enormous advantage. The side that miscalculates these fundamentals fights at a disadvantage that no amount of courage or tactical brilliance can completely overcome. And sometimes, history turns on something as simple as a mathematical error, a wrong number in the right equation at the crucial moment. The Pacific War was shaped by many factors, but among them was this, a miscalculation made in a Tokyo office in 1941, when someone applied the wrong multiplier to a fuel consumption estimate, and no one caught the error until ships were already at sea, committed to an operation that would change the world. Rest well, dear listener. Tomorrow, another story awaits.